Oh, hello. Just catching up on some reading while I'm off duty at home. It's amazing to think that 20 years ago we were fighting over in France, and here I am reading about us retreating from France right now and pulling our boys out of there. Beggars belief that the war that we thought was to end all wars didn't. But you're too young to remember all of that. So I thought what I'd do is just go through some of the things that have happened and just try to explain why we're in the situation where we are now, where we're once again at war with Germany. And you have to go back to 1918. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, we thought that was it. We thought that was the end of everything. All anybody wanted was peace. The politicians, the people, they wanted peace. 10 million people had been killed. 5 million people were still disabled or wounded and carrying the scars of battle. Families had been torn apart. And people just wanted peace. They thought that can never happen again. And so they went to Versailles, the big allied countries of Britain, France, America. They all went to the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris, to create a lasting peace. But not everything was that simple. France had been ravaged by war, and it wanted revenge. It had been invaded twice by Germany, 1870 and 1914, and it vowed never to allow that to happen again. Millions of its people had been killed. Thousands of acres of land had been destroyed by war, and France wanted compensation. Britain just wanted to return to what it had been before, the most powerful empire in the world, and to carry on as normal. America saw it slightly different. America wanted to create a lasting peace. It wanted a sense of reconciliation and to create a body, an international body, that would be a group that could, govern the world, and disputes could be sorted out politically rather than by fighting. Germany wasn't invited. Germany wasn't allowed to go to the peace talks. Most people blamed Germany for starting the war. Most people blamed Germany for all the deaths and destruction that had happened. So when the peacemakers finally drew up the treaty, Germany was forced to sign it. Sign it, or the war will continue. Germany was a proud, militaristic people. Many people look back and say that they weren't to blame. But that wasn't the idea, that wasn't the attitude at Versailles. So they were forced to sign it. And there were some harsh terms. Even for those of us who were involved and saw the death and destruction. Some of those terms were quite harsh for a proud nation like Germany. Their army was limited to 100,000 men. Their navy was limited to 6 battleships and no submarines. No more U-boats sinking merchant men in the Atlantic. It wasn't allowed an air force. It had to give up all its colonies around the world. And it had to give up land in Europe. It had to give back the land it had taken from France in 1870, and it had to give land to Poland to protect its eastern borders. France wanted Germany in a position where it could never again be an aggressor in Europe. And those measures made sure of that. But perhaps the biggest and harshest thing was the reparations, the compensation that Germany had to pay. Somewhere in the region of £6 billion in compensation had to be paid. Money that really no country could afford, let alone a country that had just lost a war. So things started to go wrong right from the start. The German government, known as the Weimar Republic, they weren't experienced. They were weak. They were forced into signing the treaty. And the German people blamed them, said it was their fault, that they'd given in too easily. But they had no choice. So things went from bad to worse in Germany. In the 1920s, while we were all enjoying the roaring 20s and the high life, Germany was suffering from high unemployment, rapidly rising inflation, hugely inflated prices on goods, and a sense of despair, despondent, and anger. And then, as we all know, 1929 came along, the Wall Street crash, and led to the Depression of the 1930s. Every country suffered in the 1930s depression, but for Germany, it was worse. In many countries around the world in the 1930s, there was a growth of extreme politics. In Russia in 1917, the communists had had their revolution, and by the late 1920s, the communist government was well in situ and in power, and one of its aims was to spread communism to other countries around the world. So there were communist parties growing up in each of the European countries. There were fascist parties growing up in each of those countries. In Italy, under Mussolini. In Spain, under Franco. And in Germany too. In the 1920s, Adolf Hitler, the man we now know as the leader of Nazi Germany, had been a disillusioned ex-soldier. He'd fought in the First World War, he'd been wounded twice, and he was even decorated for bravery, believe it or not. But he found his way to joining the far-right party called the National Socialists, what we now call the Nazi Party. And despite attempts to seize power with a failed coup in Munich, by 1933 his party had grown in size, and its attractiveness to the German people had grown too. And in 1933, in the election, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party were voted in, and he became Chancellor, Prime Minister, basically, of Germany. But he was voted in. He didn't seize power, he didn't take it by force. He'd become attractive to what the German people wanted. And you can sort of see why. He gave them jobs. Germany became strong and powerful again. By 1935, he rebuilt the army. He was building planes. He was building ships and submarines. He was tearing up the Treaty of Versailles in the hope that France and Britain did nothing to stop him. And sad to say, we didn't really, did we? Look where we are now. If only we'd have stopped him there. To really test us, Hitler ordered his troops into the Rhineland area. Now that area had supposed to have been demilitarized. No troops were supposed to be in there. Areas of it were occupied by French and British troops for a long time after that Great War. But when Hitler marched in there in 1935, he waited to see what would happen. And nothing happened. If we'd only taken the lead then, if we'd only forced him back then, things would have been so different. The French were ready for it. The French were much stronger than him. But we all wanted peace. By late 1930s, it becomes obvious that Hitler wants to expand Germany. One of the things that had been banned from the Treaty of Versailles was a union between Germany and Austria, an Anschluss. But in 1938, that Anschluss takes place. The Austrian Chancellor, who was basically a puppet for Hitler, invites German troops into Austria for peacekeeping, to help keep order. The troops are welcomed into Austria, and soon after, Hitler uses the excuse that the German-speaking people of the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia, they were under threat. So he marched troops into the Sudetenland to protect the German-speaking people of there. And what did Britain and France do? Well, this time we were a little bit more proactive. And the French Prime Minister and our Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, they travelled to Munich to meet with Hitler. And, we thought that was going to be it. There was a negotiation. Hitler wouldn't take any more land. We'd let him keep what he already had. He could keep his union with Austria. He could keep his armed forces. We understood that he needed to protect German-speaking people, perhaps in Czechoslovakia. But no more. That was it. Line was drawn. He wasn't to go any further. Neville Chamberlain returned to this country, waving his bit of paper. We've all seen the newsreels. Waving his bit of paper. Peace in our time. Didn't last very long. By 1939, we can see that war is approaching. And we can see that Hitler's next target will be Poland. He's already signed a pact, a peace treaty with Russia. Communists and Nazis together. That had to spell trouble. So on September the 1st, 1939, using the excuse that a wireless station had been attacked by Polish troops, Hitler sends his army into Poland. Now, Britain and France had said to Hitler at Munich, this is it, no more. And when it was obvious that Poland was to become his next target, Britain and France agreed that if Poland was to be attacked, then they would declare war on Germany. But Hitler didn't believe them. Why should he? They'd done nothing to stop his expansions so far. So why couldn't he just do what he wanted? So on the 1st of September, when his troops rolled into Poland, Britain and France issued an ultimatum to him. Unless you withdraw your troops from Poland by the 3rd of September, we'll declare war. Sadly, that didn't happen. And so on the 3rd of September 1939, our Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had to go on the radio and announce to this country and the Empire that once again we were at war with Germany. And that's how we end up here. But we know preparations have been taking place in this country for war long before that 3rd of September declaration of war. A lot of us will have seen some of the pamphlets that have been coming out from the government. Fire precautions in wartime, war emergency, air raid precautions. This war is going to be very different for civilians. There weren't any real bombing raids on this country during the last war. Sure, there were some Zeppelin raids on London and so on, but nothing on the scale of what we could think can happen this time. With the size of planes and the ability of planes to carry bombs, I think it's only a matter of time before we see those fall on this country. One of our biggest fears, I suppose, is gas. Lots of us have already had our gas masks, and everybody else that hasn't, you'll be getting yours soon. This one's for an adult. Children, you'll probably get one that's slightly different, and you'll have to start carrying this all the time and learning how to put it on. Identity cards. We need to know who's who. We need to know what you're up to. In the last war, we had rationing, and it's pretty certain rationing will come in again. So don't be surprised if food starts to get a little bit short. And some of you might have already had your evacuation notices telling you what to take with you, and your name tags. Some of you from the big cities or the ports, you may well already be away from home. Those of you in the country, you may already have other children staying with you from those big cities. And some people have decided not to send their children away, to keep them at home. And you can understand that. Who wants to be away from their children in war? And so, we need to be ready. We need to make sure that this country's ready. And as I said right at the start, just reading about Dunkirk and France gone, what's next? Will he turn his attention to us? Will he try and invade this country? That's our biggest fear, I think. An invasion of Britain. Will his bombers come and bomb our cities? Who knows? Anyway, let's get back to my newspaper. Lots of information for you there. In case you missed any of it, you can go to the usual place and find it again. And you can find some activities as well to help you process all that and to help your understanding. We'll talk again soon, but for now, take care.